Hello, good morning, and welcome to our traditional post-budget event. Actually, the first post-budget event we've had since October 2021. All of those fiscal events since then were just that, fiscal events, and it's nice to get back to a fairly normal sort of a budget. Today, we will be having some comments from me, and then four of my colleagues will be speaking briefly, I should say. First, we'll have Carl Emerson, who will talk about the public finances, some of the issues around public spending. Then Isaac de Lestre will talk about the tax changes that we saw yesterday. Tom Waters will talk very briefly about the changes to universal credit and disability benefits in particular. And then Christine Farquharson will round up with an analysis of the biggest change, which was the introduction of a big childcare subsidy. You should have a link to Slido to ask questions, so please do that. We will leave plenty of time for questions at the end, and do vote up questions that you like. I will see those first. We are aiming to finish dead on 12 o'clock, so we shouldn't detain you for more than an hour and a half, of which hopefully no more than half will be us speaking, and the other half will be you asking questions and us trying to answer them. You can't see them, but a few of my other colleagues are also lurking on this call, and hopefully between us we'll be able to answer most of the questions that you put. But let me start by just making some introductory comments. I think the first thing to say is, of course, that Mr. Hunt was presented with a slightly better fiscal outlook than he faced in November. But don't forget, it's still much worse than we expected a year ago. It's very much too easy to compare these numbers with the most recent ones. Actually, looking back even a little way in history is quite important. Mr. Hunt decided to spend the larger part of the windfall that he's got since November, but note the difference with what happened in November. Then the forecast got much worse. He just lived with the extra borrowing. So if they get better and you borrow, when you use the extra borrowing, they get worse and you keep the extra borrowing. That's how borrowing ratchets up year on year. The two big ticket items were a childcare offer for the under threes and a temporary full expensing for investments in corporation tax. There was more money for defence and the traditional, and this time particularly expensive, cut in the real terms level of fuel duty. As far as the economic forecasts are concerned, the OBR are much more positive than the Bank of England and than many other forecasters about medium-term growth. The Chancellor should be grateful at least for that small mercy, but to repeat what I said back in November, it is slightly odd. I don't know if it's damaging, but it's certainly slightly odd that we have our monetary policy and our fiscal policy made on the basis of two extremely different economic forecasts. Despite those relatively somewhat better economic forecasts over at least the short run, the outlook for the public finances does still look difficult. Tax continues to rise to its highest ever level and to much higher levels than in recent decades. Yet, even with very tight spending penciled in from 2024, debt is barely falling. And that's because a high debt level, high debt interest payments, additions to debt not included in borrowing, and sluggish nominal growth make it hard to get debt on a decisively downward path. And this really matters. To quote the OBR, it is now harder for this Chancellor to deliver a falling path for the debt to GDP ratio in the medium term than it has been for any of his predecessors since the OBR was established in 2010. That's quite a statement, not least remembering where we were back in 2010. As a result, Mr. Hunt was hemmed in by his own fiscal target to get debt falling in the last year of the forecast period. While its level, the level of debt that is expected to be lower than November, the trajectory remains stubbornly flat. And that has led him to rely on a combination of tight spending plans, imaginary future increases in fuel duties, and a fiscal gain from unwillingly undoing his corporation tax change at the end of the period in order to appear to meet this rule. This is not a terribly sensible way of being guided by such rules. That said, this budget did lay out some elements of a sensible strategy to support growth. There's plenty to quibble with, and I will quibble, but if you want to focus on growth, there's at least some of what you might want here, attempting to deal with incentives to work and to invest. Now, much of the focus was on getting more people back to work. The OBR rewarded the Chancellor by suggesting he might have some success in this, but the numbers are modest. If the total effect of the measures is indeed to get just over 100,000 more people into work, as the OBR suggests, and let's be clear, that is a very uncertain forecast. That would be just a fraction of the number lost from the workforce in the last couple of years alone. It's dwarfed by annual net immigration numbers assumed at 245,000. Even the change in assumptions about migration increases the numbers in work by 160,000 over the period. The OBR reckon the overall labour supply package will cost about $7 billion a year and increase employment by around 110,000. That's a cost of nearly 70,000 per job. Obviously, the money will do other things like provide childcare, but given the Chancellor's focus on increasing the numbers of jobs, I think that's an interesting calculation to make. Now, if this budget is remembered for anything, and I do think it should be remembered for this, I think it actually will be one of the few budgets that will be remembered in 10 years' time, and it'll be remembered for the extension of free childcare to working families with children under the age of 3. This is a major expansion of the welfare state. It's sort of the end of a journey. At the start of the century, very little preschool childcare was paid for by government at all. We'll soon be spending over $8 billion a year, with the government paying for over 80% of all formal childcare for preschoolers in England. Now, that brings risks for the childcare market if provision is not funded appropriately. My colleague Christine Farquharson will talk us through that. But it also reflects a major change in the scope of the welfare state and our expectations of what it should provide. It's an example, actually, of a ratcheting up both of expectations and of spending. The impact this will have on labour supply is highly uncertain, though the OBR score it as the biggest policy contribution to increasing numbers in work. The main effect will actually just be to reduce the cost of childcare for those working parents who would have paid for childcare anyway. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's important to acknowledge. While there are also welcome reforms to ease life for universal credit claimants making use of childcare, this is actually the logical endpoint of a journey which started, remember, by focusing on early education and reducing inequalities at the start of school, but has ended with an overwhelming focus on providing childcare to working families to reduce their costs and allow more parents to work. Those are completely different objectives. So there's been a big shift from spending on poor children to a universal offer for those with working parents, or near universal. One policy that really won't play a big part, if any, increasing the number of people in work is the increase in the pension tax annual and lifetime allowance. Even on the OBR's, in my view, optimistic assumptions, this will come in at £100,000 a job. There's a case for allowing people to save more in a pension, even if those who gain will generally be on high incomes. But while it was sensible to accompany this change with a limit on the size of the tax-free lump sum to 25% of the existing lifetime allowance, it was, to say the least, disappointing that other over-generous aspects of pension taxation, not least the complete freedom from inheritance tax, were not reined in at all. The lack of any coherent strategy here remains deeply disappointing. Don't forget, these changes are largely a rowing back on changes made just a few years ago by this same Conservative government. Somewhere else, where over recent years there's been, in my view, a complete lack of apparent long-term strategy, is corporation tax. Not only have we had the main rate taken all the way down to 19% and then all the way back up to 25%, we've had ever-changing policy in most other aspects. Moving to full expensing of plant and machinery investment, as proposed yesterday, does make some sense. But first, if this was the direction of travel, it should have been announced when the higher rate of corporation tax was announced. What possible excuse is there for making change of this scale and it is a big change, fully 2 years after that announcement, leaving companies ignorant of what was to come next? Second, formally doing it temporarily, whilst claiming an ambition to make it permanent, only adds to the uncertainty in the system. This appears to be done largely to help meet the debt rule. This really is the tale of a badly designed fiscal rule wagging the dog of fiscal policy. Government needs to learn that stability and consistent long-term strategy are vital for companies looking to invest and therefore for securing better living standards. And third, and importantly, this change will only apply to investment in certain assets and will actually end up providing a big subsidy for debt-financed investment. That is not a good thing. There is much more about the corporate tax system which needs sorting out, and my colleague Isaac de Lestre will say rather more about that. So very disappointing that no more done there, no sense of strategy, and that it's been done on an apparently temporary basis. The other substantive policy aimed at increasing numbers in work is the plan to end the so-called work capability assessment for disabled recipients of universal credit. Instead, the health assessment currently used for a totally different benefit, personal independence payment, available to help with the extra costs of living associated with disability, irrespective of income or work status, will now serve a dual purpose, by also determining whether those on universal credit can get additional means-tested support. This is a potentially radical policy, but it's also a risky one. The idea is that capability for work is not a simple binary, and those with health conditions that only partially limit their capacity for work should get support without facing such strong disincentives to find a job. But the dilemma is the following. About 1 million people on universal credit are deemed to have work-limiting health conditions, but are not currently receiving personal independence payment. Under these proposals, then, 600,000 of them could end up losing £350 a month, and 60% of those have mental health problems. To avoid that, the government could widen eligibility criteria for personal independence payment, but remember, personal independence payment is also available irrespective of income or work status, so to far more than those now on universal credit. So the potential for yet another upwards pressure on disability benefit spending would be considerable. After all, it is the non-means tested disability benefit caseloads that have been on a rapid and long-term upward trajectory. Even more benefit spending decisions are now to be loaded onto that part of the system. In sum, very careful design is needed to avoid either runaway spending or hitting low-income sick benefit recipients, or potentially both. There's a long way to go in getting the design of this policy right. My colleague Tom Waters will say more about that. What about the rest? Well, just to return, there was the inevitable and fiscal sleight of hand, the pretense, and it just is a pretense, that fuel duties will always rise next year when they never rise this year, is becoming increasingly wearisome. It makes, frankly, a bit of a nonsense of the fiscal forecast. If you can't even undo a supposedly temporary 5p a litre cut to duty when the price at the pump has fallen by something like 40p, you might as well admit defeat. There was no discussion of public spending. Chancellor left his post-2025 spending plans unchanged in cash terms. Ever so slightly higher inflation in the OBR forecast reduced the real terms growth rate associated with those from 1% a year to 0.9%, not a big change. Some additional spending on childcare and defence takes the growth rate back up to 1%. So in that sense, nothing has changed since the autumn. We're back where we started. But within that, we're now going to spend more on childcare and defence, so less on everything else. The spending plans outside of childcare and defence are even tighter than those announced in November. What about what he really didn't say? Nothing on public sector pay. Now, in my view, it is simply implausible that there will not be extra money available. You cannot keep cutting the pay of teachers, nurses and civil servants, both in real terms and relative to the private sector, without consequences for recruitment, retention, service delivery, morale, and, as we've seen yesterday and today, strikes. Money will have to be found from somewhere. Perhaps the Chancellor will dip into his fairly substantial 14 billion reserve for next year to fund a one-off or backdated pay award. More generally, the argument that this is not affordable founders on the fact that Mr. Hunt found 20 billion a year yesterday for other things. This is, of course, as all of this is, a question of choices and priorities. Finally, what households are going to feel over the next year will be continuing pain. Inflation may be coming down, but prices remain much higher than 2 years ago. Earnings haven't caught up. The freezing of income tax and NIC's personal allowances and thresholds will cost most basic rate taxpayers about £500 next year, and most higher rate taxpayers £1,000. The OBR may be relatively optimistic about the medium term, but it still thinks these will be the worst 2 years on record for household incomes. Its projections suggest that real household disposable incomes will be no higher in 2027 than they were in 2019, barely higher than in 2017. And a lost decade, one might say another lost decade for living standards. The OBR's optimism on the economy may not be widely shared for a little while yet. I'm going to stop there. That is my take on some of the big themes of yesterday's budget. You will now hear much more detail and lots of pretty charts from my colleagues, Carl, Isaac, Tom, and Christine. I'm going to hand over to them. They will go through their presentations. As they're doing so, please put your questions onto Slido, and then we will come back at the end of their presentations and answer your questions.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to start by going through the OBR's forecast for the economy and for the public finances and highlight some of the risks around those forecasts. So let's start with the outlook for the economy. So the grey area here shows you the range of independent forecasters that are surveyed by the Treasury each month. This shows you the range that was given in February, with the solid line showing the average of that range. So you can see there's a lot of uncertainty. There's not a lot of agreement over what the economy might do over the next few years. If we go back to November and look at the OBR's forecast that they had then, you can see they were actually forecasting a much deeper downturn this year, but then a relatively strong recovery, and are more optimistic about the medium term than what the latest independent forecasters are. If we look at the Bank of England, their most recent forecast from February, again, they're more optimistic about 2023. They don't think the downturn would be as bad as what the OBR thought in November, but it's very striking that over the following 2 years, they have a really dismal forecast for growth in the economy. We must really hope that that proves to be too pessimistic. What the OBR presented yesterday was a much more optimistic set of forecasts. They agree that we're going to avoid that sharp downturn this year, and then we're going to return to pretty strong growth. And you can see that while their forecast is within the range of independent forecasters, it is towards the top end. And if you look at 2025 in particular, you can see that Mr. Hunt must really be hoping that the OBR is right and that the Bank of England is wrong about what's going to happen to the economy. Certainly the public finances and indeed our incomes would all be in a much worse state if the Bank of England's pessimism turns out to be justified. So the OBR are more optimistic about growth than they were in November, more optimistic about growth than many. That doesn't make them particularly optimistic about what's going to happen to household incomes over the next few years. So the chart here takes the OBR's forecast for average real disposable income of households and shows you how recent history compares to those projections. And as Paul just said, essentially what this is showing is that even by 2027, incomes are around the same ballpark as what they were in 2019, and indeed not that different from 2017 or 2015. So a very poor period for household income growth. If we compare that to an alternative world where post-2008, the economy just continued growing, household incomes just continued growing at the rate we've been used to, we would now be much, much financially better off. We'd be in a situation where households' incomes on average were something like £10,000 a year bigger. So that shows you the level of household income. I think what this chart doesn't really show you that clearly is how big the decline is over this year and next. So let's just focus on that for a moment. So this chart's going to show you the change in incomes between 1 year and the next for each year that we have comparable data. And you can see there that the OBR is forecasting that this year will be the biggest drop in average household incomes, and next year the second biggest drop on record. So a very poor period for household incomes, despite the OBR being more optimistic than it was in November. Now, one driver of that, why are household incomes looking so poor given the economy is not looking quite as bad as we might have thought, is what's happening to taxes. The government is essentially taking a bigger share of national income in tax revenues that naturally will bear down on household incomes. So the chart here shows you total tax receipts as a share of national income going back to 1948 and the latest OBR projections. And you can see a pretty steep increase in the tax burden going on at the moment. That's because of some tax measures that Isaac will talk you through later on. And it's bringing that tax burden up to levels that the UK hasn't seen in recent decades by quite a considerable margin, and indeed up to a level that the UK has never sustained in its history. So we're moving to a higher tax economy. What's this meaning for government borrowing? Well, if we go back 12 months, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor. This is what he was forecasting for the deficit. 4% of GDP this year, declining to just over 1% of national income in the medium term. If we skip forward several chancellors and to the next set of OBR forecasts that we got, that's November, you can see the outlook had changed pretty dramatically. In particular, two things had gone on. Russia had invaded Ukraine, European gas prices were much higher. The government had responded with a big package of support for households and businesses. Plus, we'd seen some other policy measures that persist into the medium term. In particular, the government had decided to scrap the health and social care levy before it came in. So a combination of those things meant that we were on course to borrow more in each and every year by quite a considerable margin. How did the OBR's forecast change? Well, had Mr. Hunt yesterday stood up and said he wasn't going to do any measures, he was just going to stand up, tell us the forecast and then sit down again, we'd be on this path here. This is the pre-measures forecast that the OBR presented the government. So lower borrowing, not just this year and next, but lower borrowing throughout the forecast horizon, as they believe that we don't just benefit from less government spending on the energy price guarantee, we're also getting more receipts that will persist into the medium term. We've also got that extra growth, which is helping too. But as you'll hear from my colleagues, Mr. Hunt did set out a set of measures, in particular some spending increases and some tax cuts, which mean that we're on course to borrow more than what that pre-measures forecast would imply. And indeed, over the next couple of years, it brings borrowing back up towards the levels that he was forecasting in November. So if we take 24-25, between March and November, the OBR said to Mr. Hunt, well, actually, we think that our underlying forecast has worsened by £45 billion. How did he react to that? Well, he essentially decided to borrow it all. He said, well, I'll just respond by offsetting just £3 billion of that extra borrowing through higher taxes or lower spending. The rest of it I'm comfortable to borrow. Now, obviously, there is a case for doing that. But yesterday, essentially, the OBR had told Mr. Hunt, well, between November and March, we now think in that same year, there's an £18 billion improvement. So previously, we told you things have got £45 billion worse. Now we think things have got £18 billion better. How did he respond to that? Well, he chose not to bank any of that money. He essentially chose to give it all away through tax cuts and spending increases. So in the first period, things got worse. He decided to essentially allow borrowing to rise. In the second period, things got a bit better, and he decided not to allow borrowing to be lower, instead to give the money back. And that kind of ratchet effect when you get hit by shocks will cause, if you keep doing it, borrowing to be continually increased over time. So borrowing put back to where he was expecting in November over the next couple of years. It's worth noting at the end of the forecast horizon, he didn't give away all of the improvement in the outlook in terms of through lower taxes or higher spending. He did choose to have a lower profile for borrowing than what was expected in November. That brings us back to a current budget surplus where the government is only borrowing to invest. It also brings us back to what's known as a primary surplus, where the government is actually only borrowing to cover its debt interest costs. That's pretty rare in the UK. So in some sense, the borrowing figures for the end of the forecast horizon do look, in a historical perspective, arguably reasonably prudent. What does that mean for government debt? So this is public sector net debt as a share of GDP as forecast in November, and this is public sector net debt as forecast yesterday. You might look at those two lines, and if I was to ask you, well, which one would you prefer to be the case? If you're all else equal, which would you rather we were at? I think most people would probably pick the blue line. If all else could genuinely be equal, we'd presumably rather have lower debt than higher debt. But Mr. Hunt has a fiscal target that doesn't target the level of debt, it targets the change in debt. In particular, it focuses on the change at the end of the forecast horizon. Back in November, debt was forecast to fall very slightly between years 4 and 5, falling by a margin of £9 billion. On yesterday's forecast, it's actually forecast to fall by an even smaller margin, a margin of just £6 billion. These margins are absolutely tiny relative to the uncertainty in projecting the change in debt on that timescale. To give you a sense of how tiny it is, supposing the OBR revised down its growth forecast, its nominal growth forecast by 0.2 percentage points, that would put you on course to miss the target. How big is a 0.2 percentage point revision? Well, it's half the revision that we've seen between November and March. Alternatively, suppose Mr. Hunt actually said, I'm going to freeze fuel duties throughout this period, and I'm going to boost public sector pay by an additional 1% relative to what I'm currently planning. That would also put you on course to see debt rising in that final year. So a very, very tiny margin of error. Debt could easily rise in 27, 28. So that naturally asks us a question, well, might the Chancellor have more wiggle room in future? What about when we get to November, we get to an autumn budget, the date of the next general election gets closer, might he have some wiggle room? Well, at that point, it's not the fall in debt between 26, 27 and 27, 28 that matters. We'll roll forward a year. It'll be the fall in debt over the subsequent 12-month period that will matter. And if we care about the true health of the public finances, it's very difficult to forecast what's going to happen to debt over that period. But I think it's fair to say that many of the pressures we see at the moment, weak nominal growth, the interest rates the government's bearing, the cost of servicing the government's debt, also some things that add to debt which don't count in borrowing, they're likely to persist for some time yet. So I think in a genuine sense, it's not likely to be the case that debt is going to be very easy to get falling between 27, 28 and 28, 29. Now, what adding another year to the forecast horizon might do to the Chancellor is lead him into the temptation of saying, well, I get an extra year where I can pencil in perhaps some tax rises that I perhaps won't even do. Maybe I'll pencil in another year of increasing field duty in line with inflation. Or maybe I'll pencil in yet another year of squeezing public spending. So that kind of thing would give you some apparent headroom. But if unless those policies really can be followed through on, it's not really genuinely there. And that kind of fiscal sleight of hand is exactly the kind of thing we don't want to see in the autumn budget. So how easy is getting debt down over the medium term likely to be? Well, notwithstanding concerns about how difficult it is to forecast this, I just want to show you a couple of very, very broad brush illustrative scenarios. I'm going to ignore those things that add to debt that don't count in borrowing. I'm going to assume the government runs a primary balance, so it borrows only to pay for its debt interest costs over the longer term. And I'm going to assume that interest rates remain where they're currently expected to be. And what the graph shows you is mathematically what would happen to debt as a share of GDP under two scenarios. What if growth follows the OBR's expectation of long-run growth, or what if it follows the Bank of England's expectation? If we're in the OBR scenario, you can see that debt is falling as a share of GDP over the medium term. You might argue about whether that's decisive or not. It would still see debt at 80% of GDP in 2040. Under the Bank of England forecast, I think it's pretty clear that there isn't really a decisive fall in debt. And the next time a bad shock comes along, for example, a recession, it's pretty clear we'd see debt ratcheting up again. So that would really not be a great fiscal situation to be in. Supposing growth was in line with the Bank of England forecast and there was nothing we could do about that, and we wanted to get back to that lower line, how much of a fiscal tightening would we need to do? Well, you'd be talking about 1% of GDP. So tax rises and spending cuts totaling about 25 billion a year in today's terms would be required to get you from that upper line to that lower line, just as an illustration. So one thing that's really causing the difficulty here is debt interest spending. We have elevated debt, as I've just shown you. Interest rates on that debt means we're spending more on debt interest. Now, the average since 2010 has been that we would devote about 2% of national income to debt interest. Prior to the pandemic, the forecast implied it would remain below that level. And even if we roll back 12 months, the forecast produced then expected just a one-year spike in debt interest payments before it falling back down below that 2% level. That's no longer the case. The November forecast, and indeed yesterday's forecast, suggests that while debt interest spending is spiking this year, it's going to return down to a level that's well above that 2% average. And we'll be spending about 1% of GDP a year more on debt interest than what we would have expected just a year ago. That makes all of the fiscal arithmetic more difficult for the Chancellor. So I just want to finish with a couple of key risks to the forecast. One is on public sector pay. Lots of pressure to increase public sector pay, not least because many public sector workers have experienced real pay cuts over the last decade. Looking to the next financial year, departments are claiming they can afford within their budgets about an increase of about 3.5%. That would be lagging behind what the OBR and what the Bank of England thinks is going to happen to private sector pay. If the government wanted to match private sector pay growth, it would probably need to find something like £2.5 to £5 billion to do that. If it wanted to go further and it wanted to try and unwind the drop in public sector pay in the current financial year relative to private sector pay, it would need to find an additional £9 billion to do that. Now, consolidated public sector pay awards might be difficult. They're going to be permanent. They're going to add to spending pressures on an ongoing basis. If we wanted to fund some backdated awards or some one-off awards, the government could look to its reserve. As Paul mentioned, it's got about £14 billion squirreled away in that reserve. Now, the government might be hoping that that's there for things like extra support for Ukraine or extra support for energy bills, were energy prices to move up again. But at least some of that perhaps could be devoted to public sector pay awards. The second pressure on the spending plans really come from the period beyond April 2025, where I think the spending plans look really quite tight, particularly given the Chancellor now saying he wants to get defence spending up to 2.5% of national income. I'm just going to talk you through an illustrative scenario on that. Total public spending is being planned to grow by about 1% a year over that period. You might think, well, that's not too bad. You could increase budgets all by 1% a year. But let's suppose the NHS actually sees budget increases in line with its long-run average. That's about 3.8% a year. Let's suppose, given that the school numbers are falling, let's suppose the government manages to freeze school spending, but that Jeremy Hunt is serious about his defence target. He wants to get to 2.5% of GDP at the end of this decade, and he wants to do that in a straight line way. Well, that means the defence budget would need 6.8% a year increases. Overseas aid spending would need to grow by 2.1% a year to keep at 0.5% of national income. And if we're going to pay for those childcare promises set out yesterday, that's going to require spending increases of about 12.2% a year. What would that mean for everything else? Well, it would mean cuts of about £18 billion, 3.2% a year on average. That's pretty deep cuts to areas like local government, further education, courts, prisons, and the like. And the final risk I want to flag is on the revenue side. It's about field duty. So the line here shows you the supposed plan for the rate of field duty as set out in June 2010. This shows you the successive plan as every year that whoever was Chancellor said, oh, I'll just freeze it for one more year and then I'll return to indexation. And indeed, that's what the current plan implies. It suggests that in a year's time, we'll get rid of the temporary 5p cut and we'll return to RPI indexation. The OBR has pointed out that over this total, in cumulative terms over this period, we've given away about £80 billion in field duty cuts. And remarkably, in the coming financial year, field duty revenues in cash terms will be about the same as they were in 2008-9. If going forward, we want to continue freezing revenues, it will reduce government revenues by about £4 billion in 2027-28. So to conclude, over the next couple of years, the Chancellor chose to give away rather than bank most of the improvement in borrowing that the OBR handed him. Over the longer term, despite a return to current budget surplus, he's left with a wafer-thin margin of error against his poorly designed debt target. And this poorly designed target might well be pushing Mr. Hunt into some unwelcome policy decisions. There's lots of pressure to tax less and lots of pressure to spend more, and this could easily lead to debt actually rising in that year. Freezing field duties, retaining full expensing that Isaac's going to talk you through, and avoiding departmental spending cuts could easily cost the government an extra £25 billion, wiping out the wiggle room that the Chancellor has. So I'll now hand over to Isaac, who's going to talk you through the tax changes in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl. So I'm going to talk a little bit about changes to the tax system now. The biggest change that we can expect to see in the tax system from April, at least for personal taxation, actually isn't something that the Chancellor announced yesterday. It's something we already knew was going to happen, which is that income tax and national insurance thresholds are frozen in cash terms from this year to the next. Now, with inflation running at 10% this year, that's really going to bite pretty hard. So what I'm showing you with this line here is the additional tax that someone at a given level of earnings can expect to pay between this year and next year as a result of these threshold freezes. You can see that for basic rate taxpayers, at least most basic rate taxpayers, they can expect to see an increase in tax of about £500. For most high rate taxpayers, that's about £1,000. That's going to see about 1.7 million people brought into the income tax system by these threshold freezes, and it's going to see about 1.2 million people paying higher rates than they otherwise would have done as a result of these freezes. Now, worth noting, that's just the impact from this year to next year. This is only 1 year of a 6-year freeze. If we look at the impact between now and the end of that multi-year freeze. I can show you that impact on the yellow line. You can see it's going to be even bigger. By the end of this period, most basic rate taxpayers are going to be paying around £800 more a year in tax. Most higher rate taxpayers, that's going to be around £1,700 a year. Now, in terms of things that the Chancellor did announce yesterday, one of the biggest changes to personal tax was his changes to pension allowances. Now, there are two major allowances in the pension tax system at the moment. There's the lifetime allowance that limits how much you're allowed to build up in a pension over the course of your lifetime. And then there's also the annual allowance, which limits how much you're allowed to put in a pension in a given year. Now, both of those allowances have been cut really quite substantially over the course of the last 10 years or so. What did the Chancellor do yesterday? Well, he abolished the lifetime allowance entirely, and he increased the generosity of the annual allowance from its current level of £40,000 up to £60,000. Now, that's costed as being about £1.3 billion a year, although we'd expect it to be quite a bit less in the longer term, because a lot of the additional money put into pensions is going to end up being taxed when it's withdrawn from those pensions later on. Now, why has the Chancellor made this change? Well, a big reason is that people have tended to worry that particularly older workers bumping up against these allowances might end up withdrawing from the workforce as a result. So the Chancellor's hoping this is going to increase labour force participation, increase employment. Now, that could go either way. So on the one hand, you could see that being able to save more in a tax-advantaged pension might mean that work is rewarded more, and if you can put more, and therefore might increase employment. On the other hand, it might be the case that if people are looking to save enough for their retirement, the ability to save more in a tax-advantaged pension might mean they don't need to work quite as much to reach that goal. So they might even end up retiring earlier. Now, the OBR thinks the first of these two effects is going to be the bigger effect, and that overall workforce participation employment will increase by around 15,000. As Paul said, that's not a really big number, and it remains to be seen whether that even ends up transpiring. In terms of who will actually benefit from this policy, it's going to be those who have the ability to build up a very large pension pots in excess of the current lifetime allowance, or those who are well off enough to be able to contribute more than £40,000 in a single year to their pension. Although it's worth noting that the annual allowance is still being reduced for those with the very highest incomes. Also worth noting that's still a pretty stupid policy. Now, giving people the freedom to save more in their pension if they want to is a good thing, whether they're rich or whether they're poor. What's not a good thing is giving people who already have a lot of pension wealth additional tax subsidies to save even more in their pensions. Now, the Chancellor did take the very sensible step of limiting the tax-free 25% to the current level of the lifetime allowance. That does limit some of the subsidy that gets provided to those with very large pension pots through this reform. But it's worth noting that isn't the only subsidy to pension saving we have in our current system. There's also a big national insurance subsidy, and also the fact that pension pots are entirely exempt from inheritance tax. So those are additional subsidies that are going to be handed out to people making very large savings under these reforms. So there are things to like about this reform, but what they do is that they really emphasize some of the flaws in the current system, particularly this fact that we very bizarrely treat pension pots more favorably as inheritance vehicles than we do as vehicles for providing you with an income over the course of your retirement. Now, the other major tax change we saw in the budget was to corporation tax. Now, what's been happening with corporation tax is we've seen a long-term pattern of rate cutting over the years. Now, that's due to end in April, when we're going to have the first increase in corporation tax in more than 50 years. The rate's going to go up from 19% to 25%. Now, we can also look at the revenue from corporation tax. Now, this is revenue as a percentage of GDP. And if we look at the OBR's latest forecast, we can see that revenue from corporation tax is due to reach its highest ever level by the end of the forecast period. What does that mean internationally? Well, it means that the UK's corporation tax rate is going from being really quite competitive, one of the lowest in the developed world, to closer to the middle of the pack, although worth noting it's still lower than that of any other G7 country. Now, there may well be concerns that this could dampen investment in the UK, business investment in the UK. And so what's the Chancellor done about that? Well, in yesterday's budget, the Chancellor announced a temporary increase to the generosity of the UK's tax allowances for investment in plant and machinery. Now, that's going to take the UK's plant machinery investment allowances from being some of the least generous in the developed world to being some of the most generous in the developed world, at least for the 3 years that this policy is going to be in place. Worth noting, it is a temporary policy, even though the Chancellor has indicated that he has an ambition to make it permanent. Worth noting, this is only something that's really going to affect the very largest companies, because all companies are allowed to deduct the first £1 million of investment in plant and machinery anyway. So this is only going to really affect those companies really making very large investments. Now, it's worth noting this is a really big change in direction for UK policy. Over the last 50 years or so, we've seen successive chancellors pursuing a strategy of cutting the corporation tax rate and broadening the corporation tax base. This is basically the exact opposite. What we're doing now is narrowing the corporation tax base and increasing the rate. So how can we think about the rates and allowances in corporation tax together? Well, one way we can do that is by looking at the effective rate of corporation tax. That's the proportion of returns on an investment that are taken in tax. And we can look at that effective rate for an investment that only just breaks even. And the higher these effective rates are, the more the current system is disincentivizing investment. Now, the first thing to notice is that these effective rates vary quite a lot depending on what a particular company is investing in. Different assets end up with different effective tax rates on a break-even investment. That's not the only way in which they vary. They also vary by how investments are financed. So because debt interest is deductible for the purposes of corporation tax, debt finance investments are actually treated much more generously in the UK system. And actually that often leads to negative effective tax rates on those break-even investments, which actually means we're subsidizing investment. It means that we're allowing investments to go ahead that would be too low yield, too unproductive in the absence of the tax system. That's not a desirable thing. It's not a feature we'd like to have in our tax system. So how is this picture going to change under the Chancellor's new reforms? Well, it's going to change like this. So the first thing to notice here is that for investments in plant and machinery that are not financed by debt, the reform is going to see these zero effective tax rates on those break-even investments, meaning all tax will be collected on more profitable investments. That's a desirable feature. It means that any investment that would be worthwhile in the absence of tax is still going to be worthwhile under this policy. So that's a nice feature. That's something we'd like to see. In fact, we'd like to see zeros across the board. That isn't something that's achieved by this policy for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it only applies to plant and machinery. That means other kinds of investments are going to see their effective tax rates unchanged. There's also a big problem here with debt finance investments in plant and machinery, where what the Chancellor is doing is actually increasing the subsidy that we're providing to those investments. And that means we're going to be doing even more subsidizing of those low yield, potentially quite unproductive investments. And that's really not a desirable aspect of the system. So there are trade-offs with this policy. There are certainly desirable aspects to it, but there are also ways in which it's exacerbating elements of the current system that were already undesirable. Now, if this policy were put in place permanently, I think we would say that it's a step in the right direction, but it really is hard to defend the fact that it's only being put in place for 3 years on a temporary basis. Why is it only being put in place for 3 years? Hard to think of any good reason other than the fact that Chancellor wants to make it look like he's not going to be spending quite as much in the 4th year of the forecast. Particularly silly reason to do things, given that actually most of the peak cost of this policy is going to end up being recouped in later years, because all you're really doing is moving forward in time the point at which these allowances can be claimed. Also, by making it temporary, we're going to end up distorting the timing of investments. Firms are going to end up moving forward investments in order to land them within this 3-year window. And it's just going to add more instability and more uncertainty to a tax landscape, which frankly has just changed far, far too much in recent years. And if you want an illustration of that, this is the annual investment allowance and the various planned trajectories of the annual investment allowance that we've seen in recent budgets from different chancellors over this period. The green line is the actual path that it followed. And what this unholy mess of spaghetti shows is the government has really pursued a policy that's been extremely mercurial, changing its plans almost on a yearly basis. And that's really not what you want if you're looking to try and build a tax environment that's going to encourage businesses to make long-term investment decisions in an efficient way. So just a few conclusions to end with. So firstly, it's worth noting that these income tax and national insurance freezes really are going to bite very hard next year as a result of the high inflation this year. In terms of the other two big policies that the Chancellor announced yesterday on tax, well, the first thing to say is that neither of them is going to be quite as big as it may look on the scorecard, because a lot of the revenue is actually going to end up being recouped in the future for both policies. And the second thing to say is that while both have aspects that are desirable, both of them do have a positive aspect. They also both exacerbate some of the pretty undesirable features that we have lately in our current system. So still plenty of room there to improve things through reform. So that's all for me. I think I'm going to now hand over to my colleague Tom, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the benefit system.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Isaac. So unlike what the two presentations you've just seen, I'm just going to talk about one policy, which we found out yesterday, and I'm going to try and do it very quickly. And that policy is reform to health-related benefits. So currently in the UK, we have two health-related benefits. We have personal independence payments, or PIP, which you're entitled to if you have disability-related living costs, and it's not dependent upon whether or not you can work or your income. And with the health element of universal credit, which you're entitled to if you have a limited capability for work and you have a low income. There are also some other bits that it's not really totally clear what the government's going to do with them. I'm going to ignore that in this presentation. So the government's plan is to remove any link between benefit eligibility and the ability to work. Instead, they're going to make the health part of universal credit dependent upon getting it. And now that adds up to a potentially pretty radical reform. It's a shift from supporting people who have high living costs or can't work to only supporting the other. And there are a few potential rationales for having a high benefit related to inability to work. First, it replaces lost earnings for those that can't work. And secondly, and this relates to something I'll come back to, it reflects the fact that compared to other out of work claimants, those with disabilities might be less responsive to financial incentives. Okay, so that's the plan. What might it do? Who's it going to affect? So 2.6 million people get UC with a health condition. 1.6 million of them already get PIP and so will be unaffected by the reform, or indeed can even gain from it. But another million are not getting PIP and so potentially lose. They might be required to search for work, and about 600,000 of them could be in line for a £350 a month loss in income, though in the short run, all of them will be protected by transitional protection. Now, no doubt many will try to apply for PIP to keep their current entitlement, but if their condition doesn't create higher living costs, many won't be eligible. And so it will be tempting for the government to try to widen the PIP eligibility criteria in order to protect that 1 million. And indeed, they've already made noises in that direction. In the white paper yesterday, they said for this group, we will carefully consider whether they meet the PIP eligibility criteria, and we will consider how disabled people who need additional financial support may receive it. And indeed, they've already carved out an exception for people with a pregnancy risk or some cancer patients. But the key insight here is that PIP is not just for low-income people, and so any widening of the eligibility criteria to protect this 1 million group opens the door to more claims from people with higher incomes or less severe conditions. Now, of course, there's many other people who are not currently on any form of health-related benefit. Here, I'm putting on all those who are on any form of universal credit. You can see here there's a 0.2 million group who are on UC, don't get the health element of UC, but do get PIP. They will pretty mechanically gain about £350 a month. But then there's also millions of people who report having a disability but aren't on any disability benefits. So if the government does decide to loosen the eligibility criteria to PIP, again, to try and protect that 1 million group, there's potentially a large number of people who might be looking to put in a PIP application. And this matters because what this plan amounts to is to shift the system towards the PIP assessment criteria rather than the UC health capability to work criteria. But as you can see here, it's the PIP bit that's been growing over time. And so we're loading more of the health assessment and benefits onto the part of the system that more and more people have been successfully applying for. And in addition, any widening of the PIP eligibility criteria and the increasing financial reward for getting it might put further upward pressure on that part of the budget. So what might we think about this reform? So it strengthens work incentives. That was the government's kind of key rationale, as you can get into work or stay in work and keep the health element. That said, a large proportion of the affected group have already been assessed by the government as being far from work, and so you might see quite limited effects here. And secondly, there will be fewer assessments under this reform because you only need to be assessed once rather than twice for two separate benefits. That creates less hassle for claimants, and it also reduces the cost for the government. But there's risks and trade-offs on the other side too. First, the 1 million people on UC with health conditions but not on PIP will potentially lose out from this reform, most of them financially. Here, the government faces a core trade-off. They can accept many low-income losers, or they can widen the PIP criteria and get more high-income, less severely disabled claimants. So there's a risk, as Paul was saying, of runaway spending on the one hand, or having lots of sick, low-income people losing out on the other. Second, at the moment, those getting UC for health reasons have few job search requirements applied to them. But after this reform, there won't be any assessment of work capability, and it seems that the plan is for work coaches at job centres to decide how much you're required to search for work, taking into account your health conditions. This might be tricky for work coaches who aren't health professionals, and their decisions are important because if job search requirements aren't met, claimants will get sanctioned. And third, many more people will want to apply for PIP because of this change. That might push up wait times for the benefit, which are currently at 14 weeks, but very recently have been as high as 26 weeks. And so here, getting the resourcing right, in particular, shifting resource from the work-related assessments to the PIP assessments will be critical to ensure that we don't see ballooning wait times. That's everything I have on that policy. I'm going to pass over to Christine now to talk about childcare.
Thank you very much, Tom. The final thing that we wanted to talk about today is the really quite massive change that we saw in support for childcare in the early years in the Chancellor's budget yesterday. The biggest piece there, and the most eye-catching, was the extension of the free entitlement to funded childcare hours all the way down to children from 9 months to 2 years old in working families. The Chancellor made other reforms as well, including changes in the universal credit system and how that supports families with childcare costs, as well as some shifts in the ratios that childcare providers can use and some incentives to recruit more into the sector, some of which I'll talk through in this presentation. Let's start with that free entitlement funding, because this is really the biggest game in town. At the moment, we spend about £4 billion a year on the existing free entitlements, 15 hours a week for all 3- and 4-year-olds, 15 hours a week for some 2-year-olds in disadvantaged families, and 30 hours a week for 3- and 4-year-olds in working families. On current plans, spending was set to fall slightly in real terms over the forecast horizon, but the uplift that the Chancellor announced yesterday to existing entitlement funding will more or less be enough to keep that at a freeze at that £4 billion level in real terms. Much bigger story, though, was the expansion of the free entitlement, a 30-hour offer all the way down to children 9 months to 2 years. That'll directly benefit around half of families with a young child, and it's set to double our total spending on the free entitlement going from about £4 billion a year to about £8 billion a year. This is a huge increase in the amount of spending that we put into the earliest years. And as Paul said in his opening remarks, it represents one of the final steps towards really incorporating those first few years of life as something that the government considers to be a core part of the welfare state. Most of the reform is going to be subsidizing parents who are already spending and already using formal childcare for their young children. We estimate that around 300,000 30-hour places will be paid for by this reform. So even before parents change any of their behavior, they're currently paying for this childcare, and now they'll be getting that from the Exchequer. So this is a direct transfer from the public purse to parents. The government also expects reasonably significant labour supply impacts from this reform. The OBR thinks that around 60,000 parents will be brought into work, working an average of 16 hours per week, and a similar impact on total hours worked will come from parents who are already working, increasing the amount that they're working in paid employment. As this chart shows, though, that's a relatively small share of the total amount that we're going to be spending on this policy. Only around a sixth of the places that will be supported by this policy will be new childcare that parents are taking up because they're moving into work. The lion's share of this is really a transfer from the government to families with young children. That said, the Chancellor spoke quite a bit yesterday about the labour supply impact that he expects this policy to have, and indeed hopes that this policy will have. That sits a little bit oddly alongside the design of the system itself. First of all, the 30-hour offer covers 30 hours a week only for 38 weeks of the year, reflecting its origins as a term time early education policy. Families can spread those hours over more weeks, but that comes at the cost of fewer weekly hours, more like 22 hours a week if you're spreading it over every week of the year. Second, the entitlement will only cover families where all parents are working. There's no support, if the rules are the same as the current 30-hour offer, for people who are in education, people who are training, people who are looking for work. And these are the kinds of groups that we might think that we would particularly want to incentivize to build up those skills if what we're looking for is an increase in productivity in our labor market, not just an increase in the total number of people there. And quite importantly, using the 30-hour entitlement sets up some odd design issues for the timing of when families get support. At the moment, under the 30-hour offer, you become eligible the term after your child turns 3, assuming that you are working, and you have to apply in advance to get an eligibility code to certify that. The government recommends that you apply between 4 and 10 weeks before the term starts and you actually start accessing that place. So you have a period where you need to be in work, presumably paying for childcare out of pocket in order to apply for and then use your 30-hour offer. That creates quite an upfront barrier for some families trying to move into work, which sits particularly oddly within this budget, given that the Chancellor was at pains to remove some of those upfront barriers through the universal credit system for low-income families wanting to move into work. The final oddity here, although it affects a relatively small number of people, it affects them to quite a considerable extent. The 30-hour offer is withdrawn entirely, instantaneously, when one parent in a household earns more than £100,000 per year. Tax-free childcare is also withdrawn at that point. And so that creates a really big hit to work incentives for parents at that high point in the income distribution. Here I'm showing you in green parents' post-tax earnings based on what they would have been earning gross on the x-axis along the bottom, and then in yellow what that looks like once we net off their childcare expenses. Now, up until we get to £100,000 per year, the difference between that green line and that yellow line is relatively small, and that reflects the generosity of the giveaway the Chancellor announced yesterday. Most of these parents will now be getting most of their childcare expenses funded through this new entitlement. But once we hit £100,000, the story changes. That entitlement goes away, tax-free childcare goes away, and all of a sudden those childcare costs make a much bigger deal to families' take-home pay. And indeed, we estimate that a parent with two very young children under the age of 3, using 40 hours of childcare a week, would actually be better off earning £99,000 than they would be earning £134,000. So there's a huge region here where parents would either refuse a pay rise or more likely make changes to their pension contributions to try and muddle with the system and retain those quite valuable entitlements. Even more broadly, though, the focus on labor supply shifts the way that our early years system works. In this chart, I'm showing you the total amount of spending on the early years through free entitlement programs, through the benefits system, and through programs like tax-free childcare, and apportioning it to different groups. The light green at the bottom is programs that are universal, based just on the age of the child. The dark gray is programs that are targeted at working families who are not eligible for universal credit. The light blue is low-income workers, so specifically those who are on universal credit. And the pink at the top is low-income families, kind of independent of their working status. Under this reform, the amount that we spend for universal programs will fall from just under half to about 30% of the total. And the amount that we spend on programs targeted at working families will almost double, reaching nearly 60% of total spending on the early years. So we see from this the real shift in the shape of our early years spending and who it is that we're trying to reach with those subsidies. It has implications for more traditional distributional analysis as well. This is a kind of classic IFS post-budget decile chart where we've grouped families into 10 bins based on their household earnings, poorest at the left, richest at the right. What stands out here is that the poorest families don't benefit much from this policy at all, mainly because they're not working and so they're not eligible, but also because even if they do work, they tend to have much lower childcare expenses. We then see that the benefits increase steadily over the income distribution, reflecting the fact that higher income families tend to be those where parents are working more hours and therefore paying for more childcare expenses. So this giveaway is worth more to those towards the top of the income distribution. The fall we get in the top decile, at the very richest, reflects some of those consequences of that withdrawal at £100,000 that I spoke about just before. This all sounds like potentially very good news for parents, quite a big giveaway, particularly to those who are working a lot and using a lot of childcare. But the core uncertainty and risk here is around funding rates. Even before any sort of behavioral change, so just based on the childcare patterns that we see today, the government will now be setting the price for 80% of preschool childcare hours delivered in England. That's up from 50%. If you control that much of the market, risks to getting that funding rate wrong become much, much bigger. You might see that providers don't offer the free entitlement, or they cut back on the quality of the care they deliver, or even if the funding rate is not sufficiently enticing, that they leave the childcare market altogether. But somewhat reassuringly, I'm sure for some providers, the government does at least seem to have budgeted enough to significantly raise the rates for 2-year-olds and to introduce a higher rate for the under 2s. We heard yesterday from the Chancellor that he's intending a 30% uplift in the 2-year-old rate, which will raise that to about £7.80 per hour. And then if we assume that the government's plan is to freeze that to protect that in real terms over the forecast horizon, to be clear, this is an assumption just to give us a ballpark sense of these funding rates, then that £7.80 rate would be worth around £8.25 in cash terms by 2027. If we take that number and we use the OBR's estimates for the labour supply impact of this policy, we estimate that the funding announced yesterday could allow for a rate for the under 2s of just under £11 in cash terms by 2027. So considerably higher than the current 2-year-old rate, which itself will be considerably higher than the 2-year-old rate that's currently on offer. The big question here is just how uncertain the right rate is. It's really hard to get these things right. It's hard to get the data. It's hard to reflect all of the different dimensions on which providers vary. And so the government will need to be responsive to evidence that those rates aren't working in the way that they intend. We need to understand a little bit more about the mechanisms for setting these rates, reviewing them and revising them, not what we've tended to see in the past with the free entitlement, where the rate gets frozen in cash terms for a little while, things start to look a little bit sticky, the government announces a big one-off increase, and then we see another cash terms freeze that erodes the rate in real terms. Chancellor also announced some policy reforms yesterday for low-income workers through the universal credit system. Now, these have become less important because of the big expansion in the free entitlement. That's going to reduce demand through the universal credit system amongst those youngest children who make up around half of current universal credit childcare spending. But even so, changing the timing of universal credit childcare subsidies is likely to help some parents move into work. At the moment, they have to pay their first month of childcare expenses out of pocket before waiting to be reimbursed for 85% of those costs by the government. That leaves families who are moving into work for the first time, on average, about a third worse off in their first month of work because they're paying for childcare out of pocket and their paycheck hasn't yet hit their account. But while changing the timing of these childcare subsidies will almost certainly be welcomed by families, the risks here are around overpayments and fraud. If people claim for childcare expenses that they're not actually entitled to, it will be difficult for the government to see a way of getting all of that money back. The final piece here was the Chancellor raised the caps on childcare expenses in universal credit by 50%. That nearly restores their real terms value after an 18-year freeze since they were first introduced as part of the legacy benefit system. But while this is a good piece of policymaking to finally end a cash terms freeze in the tax and benefit system, and that should almost always be celebrated, in actual fact, this reform will have a relatively limited impact on families because for most of them, the caps that we had even beforehand weren't particularly binding. The average payout was worth only around half of the cap that families get just for one child. In summary, childcare reforms announced yesterday deliver effectively a new branch of the welfare state, and the scale of them make the consequences of funding that branch of the welfare state incorrectly much more severe than they currently are. But the bigger picture here is what we want our early years system to achieve and where we're putting our priorities and our money. At the moment, with these reforms, the Chancellor has really shifted and made it very clear that he wants to prioritize particularly supporting families with childcare costs, which will be most of what this current spending on the new free entitlement program will support, helping families who are already paying for those hours, hopefully bringing some more into work. But we've heard much less about the impacts on child development, which will be potentially an issue for the sector as a whole, thinking about moving from an early education offer to something very much focused on labor supply. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. That was, as those listening will tell, we've delved deep and we've had much to analyse and much to say, and probably said rather too much, given that that's taken a bit more of the time than planned. We've got lots and lots of questions to get through, and we will carry on a bit past 12 for those of you who want to see answers to some more of those questions. And to some extent, to speed things up, I'll take some of the questions quickly myself. Let's take some of the. There's a question about the high income child benefit charge, which has been voted right to the top. What difference would removing the high income child benefit charge make to middle income families? Why was it set up with thresholds don't rise with inflation? It's crazy that 250k pay nothing back, 160k pay it all back. Well, I don't think we could agree more with that statement. Rob, you're on the call. Do you want to add anything to that, or indeed Tom?
Yeah, I mean, just to agree, it is pretty crazy. It means that if you've got 2 or 3 kids, the effective tax rate you face in that £56,000 range, it can get very, very high. And it's very difficult to think of a good reason to do that. And because those thresholds are frozen, it also means the effective tax rate you face gets higher every year because the value of the child benefit being withdrawn goes up. So it is a clear area which is ripe for reform, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah,
I would just very quickly add, it's worth putting that together with the picture that Christine showed about the childcare cliff edge at £100,000 a year, so even higher. But you put this together, we are making an absolute pig's breakfast of the tax and transfer system for higher earning families. and which is having a bigger and bigger impact all the time, because the £100,000 threshold is also frozen every year.
Yeah, I mean, this is beginning to get really quite complicated and really quite damaging, this set of things that people are going to. Lots of people will probably put lots of effort into getting round some of these absurd idiocies in the tax system, which affects people from £50,000 upwards. Tom Rees of Bloomberg asked, deals to end the public sector strikes are looking more likely, and indeed it looks like we may even have had a settlement or be very close to a settlement for the nurses. Given the tiny headroom, will public sector pay awards mean Hunt will effectively break his fiscal rules, and how costly will those deals be? Ben, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, I can do. I think it's important to distinguish here between any temporary one-off bonus for public sector workers, which is reportedly going to be part of this NHS offer, which you could fund through either higher borrowing or through raiding the Treasury's reserve, its buffer, and any permanent consolidated pay awards. If you have bigger consolidated pay awards than what was budgeted for, you either have to ask departments to somehow find that from within their existing budgets. That's very difficult without big cuts to headcount, or you provide some extra cash. I think we don't know yet which of those it's going to be, but if the Chancellor does feel like he has to provide some extra cash to public services, that could potentially tip him over into missing those fiscal rules or being much closer to missing them than he is already.
Thank you. Richard Partington of The Guardian has asked, could scrapping of the lifetime allowance help more bankers than NHS doctors, and why do you believe it probably won't play a big part in increasing employment? I don't know how many bankers it will affect relative to doctors. I do think that if the fundamental problem that it was trying to address was doctors, then it was a rather large sledgehammer to crack a very small nut, and £1 billion sledgehammer at that. As Isaac said, it's really actually genuinely unclear which way its impact on employment will go in the long run, given that it will allow people to save more in a pension and therefore potentially at least retire earlier with a bigger pension pot. We don't have any quantitative estimates of our own, I'm afraid. Richard Vaughan from the iNewspaper, this one for you, Christine. Are you able to say whether the amount provided in the budget will be enough to ensure a sustainable childcare system?
I'd love to be able to say that. I think fundamentally no one can say that ex ante. The problem here is it's really difficult to get a sense of what providers' costs ought to be, particularly if the government is also interested in keeping things running efficiently. So the real question is going to be what the mechanisms are for revising those rates if we come in at one level and it looks like they are too low and it looks like it's not working. The real danger is that we double down on that and stick with underfunding. We need a better system to keep things moving with the evidence that we get.
Yay. Next one from Ed Conway from Sky. I'm going to throw this at you, Carl. Can you explain which measures are and are not scored by the OBR for growth? He says he vaguely recalls they don't score supply side reforms, though I think in here there are some, in a sense, the increase in the numbers of people in work that they've scored are coming from supply side reforms. Carl, have you got anything to add to that?
I mean, not so much. I mean, I think often when there's a reform which has a big effect, what the OBR will do is perhaps not take account of that big effect in the actual scorecard, but it might adjust its forecast for earnings growth or household spending. So it might adjust its macro forecast and allow it to work through that way. Often when reforms happen, the OBR in the past has taken the view of, well, relative to the difficulty of forecasting productivity growth, we don't really think there's enough evidence yet that this would move the dial, and we'd be being overly precise to say that we now think productivity growth is going to be epsilon higher than what we previously thought, and therefore we're just going to wait and see how emerging evidence comes through. And don't forget, the OBR, like many people over the last decade or so, has often overestimated rather than underestimated productivity growth. I think with the measures yesterday, it seemed pretty clear they were taking into account some labour supply effects from the pensions change, from the childcare change. There's good reasons to think in particular the childcare one will have some impact on labour supply, so it's good they're taking that into account. I get the impression that perhaps in previous years they would have taken a more kind of, well, we'll wait and see, we'll see how the reforms get implemented and how they work through before adjusting, and perhaps they're being a bit more proactive now. That may well be an improvement but it might explain why we're seeing a bit more of a shift now and perhaps less of a shift when reforms were done in earlier years of the OBR's existence.
Brilliant. There's a question about housing, which seems quite popular. We didn't see anything from the Chancellor on housing. Despite worsening housing crisis, have the Conservatives given up on trying to be the party of home ownership? Well, I don't know what the Conservatives are doing, what their view is, but I think it's fair to say that housing policy remains a dog's breakfast. We've spoken a lot about the problems with council tax, which falls too heavily on those with low value houses and not heavily enough on those with high value houses. We said a lot about the huge problems with stamp duty, which cause enormous trouble in the housing market. We know that there are problems here with planning policy. We know, of course, that home ownership has pretty much halved among people in their late 20s and early 30s over the last 25 years, with a particular impact on middle income people in that age group, related, of course, to big rises in house prices. Actually, one might hope that a more sensible level of interest rates over the coming years, whilst difficult for people in the short run, might bring house prices a little bit down and actually help to some extent those who are looking to move on to the housing ladder. Robert Cuff has asked, is the Chancellor cooking the books to meet his fiscal rules, and how does he approach that as his predecessor? I'll come to Carl in a moment. Cooking the books might be putting it a little strongly, but certainly by, as all of his predecessors have done, pretending that he's going to get money from fuel duties into the future, by claiming post-election that spending is going to go up extremely slowly. In this particular occasion, by saying he wants the full expensing to continue permanently, but he's only going to put it in the books for the next 3 years. He's flattering his fiscal books and causing absurd amount of uncertainty for companies looking to invest. And there are a number of other things in there where we have targets to increase spending on defence to 2.5% of national income. For example, on overseas aid still to get it to 0.7% of national income when circumstances allow. There's a lot of stuff in there which makes, I think, the numbers less convincing or less transparent than they might have been. Carl, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, just a bit. I mean, there's good reasons to want a forward-looking fiscal target. Sort of, if you're doing the right thing, it allows you time to adjust if shocks come along. You can support households and businesses if you've got temporarily bad news. So there's good reasons to want a forward-looking target. I think the problem, what it generates, is that a chancellor that was looking to exploit that inappropriately could start to do things like, oh, I'll just promise some tax rises or some spending cuts that I'll never deliver. And it's particularly obvious when you've got a debt target that says debt's got to fall between year 4 and 5. That's basically no constraint on your behaviour in years 2 and 3. If anything, racking up more debt earlier will make it easier to make it full subsequently. So there's a particular weakness of the current target that makes it gameable. And it's particularly worrying when you then start to see policy measures like expensing, where the Chancellor said he wants it to be permanent, but he said it's only going to be in place for 3 years. Is it a coincidence? It's in for the 3 years and actually makes his fiscal target easier to meet, not harder to meet. And it feels that, there may be some gaming going on. In terms of his predecessors, during the early 2010s, when the outlook for the economy was constantly getting revised downwards, Mr. Osborne, as Chancellor, kept pushing back the date at which we get to current budget surplus. He was doing that through extending the squeeze on public services. You could argue that was not an unreasonable response, to take more time to get back to balance. If you're going to cut spending, let's do it gradually over time. Of course, what we then saw is that as soon as we got the other side of a general election, he immediately topped those spending plans up. So it's also questionable whether those spending plans were ever really what he intended to deliver.
There's a whole lot of questions here about the pensions changes and their impact on people in the NHS. I mean, I think I'll come to Carl and Isaac in a moment. I mean, I think our general view is that there's actually a fairly strong case for increasing the annual allowance for what you can put into pensions, and probably some increase in the lifetime allowance. though that is for reasons other than helping people in the NHS. That's simply to make a slightly more coherent system. But it only really makes sense to do that if you're also going to limit some of the other extraordinary benefits. For example, and there's a question about this at the bottom, if your pension pot is inherited before you hit 75, then it's inherited free of income tax and inheritance tax. You also obviously got up to £250,000 of tax-free lump sum, which happily is being limited to that amount as these changes are made. You've got extraordinary complexity, only for very high earners, to be sure, but extraordinary complexity associated with the withdrawal of these reliefs, incredible generosity around national insurance contributions, and so on. So this really ought to have come as part of a more complete package of reform. But Carl or Isaac, do you want to add anything to that, and with particular reference to the issues in the NHS?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose I'd just say in terms of how well targeted it is, I mean, it's targeted at people who would like to or are likely to save more than £1 million in their pension, or would like to or are likely to save more than £40,000 in their pension in a given year. Senior doctors probably are one of the groups that potentially fall into that category. They're certainly not the only group. There are lots of other groups who may well benefit. I think exactly as you said before, Paul, if what you were specifically trying to do with this policy is just target NHS workers, this would be far too broad a way to do it. But there are things to like in this policy. A priori, no reason to say that people shouldn't save more in a pension if they want to. The problem, as you say, is that there are these tax breaks that come along with that additional saving, which are going to be handed out to people who potentially have really very big pension pots.
I mean, the other thing I would say, and I said in my opening remarks about the pension policy, is just, again, all over the place. It's this government that dramatically reduced these allowances, and it's now increasing them again. And a lot of the problem are related to the original changes, which frankly were not terribly well thought through. Another one for Christine. Do we have anything to say about what the childcare subsidies will do to the price of hours in holidays or for more than 30 hours a week? And is there a danger that will be pushed, that those prices would be pushed up?
Yeah, so that's exactly the risk here. At the moment, the government is funding about 50% of the hours, the childcare hours in England. Under these reforms, that goes up to 80% or even a little bit more as people start taking up that new entitlement. If you're in a situation as a nursery or a childminder where the funding rate you get for those government funded hours isn't high enough, then you're looking at either raising sort of voluntary contributions or nappy fees for the children who are taking their free entitlements. If the government says, no, you can't do that, then you're looking at putting up prices on that 20% of the market where you still have the flexibility to do that. That's a really small share of the market to be trying to recoup losses from the vast majority of the childcare market. So that's the risk that things could unravel. But I think in practice, it comes back to the funding rates. The government is planning to increase those rates and to offer a higher rate particularly for the under twos. And we also think that a lot of the provision that this policy is going to subsidize is childcare that's already happening in the market. So I note that the question also references, are we going to need loads of new childminders? Are we going to need loads of new nurseries? We estimate we'll need about 65,000 new 30-hour places from people moving into work and demanding more care. That's not nothing, but it's worth putting that against the change that we saw in ratios for the 2-year-olds, which should free up about 50,000 30-hour places if those kind of ratios are fully binding and fully passed through and providers implement them. So it will be difficult. There will be pressures on the sector, but it's not perhaps quite as dramatic as it's all just completely unworkable.
Great, thank you. I'm going to run down and take some slightly, rather than just taking the ones right at the top here. I'm going to bring David in here. Do we learn anything at all about the outlook for local government in the budget? And have we got anything to say about issues around adult social care, local authorities in financial trouble and so on. David, have you got anything to add on local government?
Yes, so there wasn't much specifically on local government in the budget. There was a top up to the potholes fund. So whilst there was a lot of talk about devolution, and there was actually some action on devolution with Greater Manchester and Birmingham and so on, and if those things are rolled out nationally, the sort of single pots of funding they will get, would be quite a change. But when it comes to money on potholes, the government tells councils, what to spend on there. So that's quite a sort of contrast to the sort of, the devolution approach, it's a ring fencing approach. Otherwise, not really much on local government, but I think there's kind of implications from some of the other changes for councils. Councils may be involved in the childcare provision rollout. Some councils do provide childcare directly. And also the chart which showed what would happen to sort of all other spending given increases in health, childcare, defence, and so on. Well, that could mean further pressure on councils in the next spending review period. They actually got quite a generous settlement for the next 2 years. We think that real terms funding could be up about 6%, 5% a year, each year over the next 2 years. But 24, 25, 26 onwards, that looks much tougher for councils. And of course, the government postponed plan reforms to social care into the next spending review period when that funding is really tight. So whether they'll go ahead or not, or whether council will have to find that money themselves, I think that's an open question.
Okay, I'm going to come to you again, David. There's a question here about this is why stack investment zones on top of free ports. Does that confirm that free ports don't drive levelling up? Have you got anything to say on that?
Yes, so we had a report out on free ports just before the budget, actually, and it looks at the sort of potential rationale for the policy, what the potential impacts might be, and so on. So I think you can make a case for these place-based policies. The main case relates to the idea that there can be what are called agglomeration benefits, positive externalities of having these economic clusters where there can be, for example, knowledge exchange between firms, they can share infrastructure, they can share pools of skilled labour. And the tax incentives being provided, there's reasonably good evidence that they will attract activity to these locations, although a lot of uncertainty about how much activity that would be. But of course, there are risks with this as well. All of that activity could be displaced from elsewhere in the UK. Not just actually people moving into the free ports or into the investment zones. It could be companies that otherwise would have set up outside, they now set up inside. It could be through the labour market. It could be the free zone, investment zone companies, because of the tax incentives, can better compete for labour. And of course, we do have labour shortages at the moment. So whilst there potentially you can make a case for these, there are also some significant risks with these policies as well. Now, I think the kind of question there also is about why is it being, located in these deprived areas as well. I think that's because it's been seen very much as a part of the levelling up policy. All of the investment zones are in the North and Midlands, in the areas where there's a mayoral combined authority. So I think it's been seen as part of the sort of levelling up policy, and as part of plans to devolve and actually plans to push more mayors down the line, because to get these zones you need a mayor.
Fantastic. I'm going to throw the next one at Carl. And the question essentially is, if we don't like the current set of fiscal rules, what will be a better set of fiscal rules?
Right. Well, there isn't a perfect fiscal rule out there that we know we should always obey in all periods, and we know that will rein in any chancellor and stop them from any misbehaving. I think we can certainly do a lot better than saying we want debt to be falling between year 4 and 5, and we're not going to worry about debt in any other year. I think it's quite clearly that's a long way from being an appropriate fiscal target. I think stepping back from a little bit, I think I'd say, well, why do we want fiscal targets? We want them to presumably help communicate what the government's trying to do, to get credibility behind its plans, to help reassure voters, help reassure markets that there's a sensible plan for managing the country's finances. And with an independent OBR, with the IFS in place, other organisations are available too. You get a lot of scrutiny posts about fiscal event. We're able to show you when, for example, the Chancellor keeps pretending that field duties are going to go up and they're never actually doing it. The OBR has some analysis of that too. So we do have the information, the transparency that allows us to hold chancellors to account. So, we're able to produce the numbers that show you, do you think those spending plans are credible? Do you think that, or do you think actually no 1% real is completely fine? Or do you think, no, that's not going to happen post-election? We can kick the tires on the forecast with all the information we have. So we shouldn't be too gloomy that actually, if a chancellor does misbehave, I think the OBR, ourselves and others are pretty well equipped to point out where perhaps the spirit behind the rules is not being followed as closely as it should be.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to keep going for another 5 minutes or so, given that there are so many questions, but I'm afraid that means we will overrun slightly. But obviously, those of you who want to stay on, please do. Question from Michael Phillips of the NASUWT. PJ, that's me, said yesterday, it's not true that giving public sector workers a bit more would significantly raise inflation. Would a real terms pay increase boost recruitment and retention and benefit the economy? I think the key point here is that keeping public sector pay falling relative to that in the private sector isn't sustainable in the long run without a fall in the quality of public services, because you'll either not be able to recruit people at all, or you'll be able to recruit people who are less well qualified than in the past. So that is a key choice for government. We saw quite a lot of choices yesterday. 20 billion a year the Chancellor found of extra tax cuts and spending rises elsewhere, but not for public sector workers, though it seems that there is something, as we've heard, being cooked up today in terms of settling the dispute with nurses. Broadly speaking, you can't simply diverge public and private sector pay over long periods of time, but there are always choices, and it may be that the government thinks that there are better ways of supporting the economy than increasing teachers and nurses' pay, for example, through incentives for companies to invest. There are always choices in these areas. Let's see what else we've got here. I mean, there's lots of questions about things the Chancellor didn't do in terms of net zero and so on, and lots more about pensions, but I don't think we'll go back over pensions. Steve Schiffers has asked, how likely is it the Chancellor will find room for tax cuts in the next budget, particularly if the rolling forward of the date he needs to meet his fiscal targets improves his fiscal headroom? Well, I think at a high level, politically, we wouldn't be surprised to see some kind of tax cuts announced in the next budget. Very often that is what happens just before elections. The big picture will be, of course, that even if he does find room for that, taxes at the end of this Parliament and going forward will be dramatically higher than they were at the start of the Parliament. But Carl, do you want to say something again about where we might be? Because I think it's a really important point, where we might be in terms of fiscal headroom once we roll forward an extra year at the next fiscal event.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that when we get to the autumn, the case for permanent tax cuts that are not matched by credible permanent spending cuts was going to be pretty weak. There is a strong case for us aiming to get debt down over the medium term. And the reason for that is we know that bad shocks come along and that leads to debt increasing. Given that, we know that we can't always have debt going up. It seems sensible to be aiming to get it down in the absence of those bad shocks. So nothing wrong with having tax cuts, but they need to be matched by credible spending cuts. And I think getting debt down is going to be proved to be quite challenging for quite some time. And that's why I'm kind of pessimistic about the case for that. Now, of course, politically, what you could see is a situation where the Chancellor, his forecast is extended for one more year. If he's going to pretend or claim that he can get away with 1% real spending growth for a couple of years, maybe he'll be tempted to put in 1% for another year. I presume he'll claim that he'll be increasing field duties in line with inflation for that one more year as well. And I think we can be pretty confident that that isn't going to happen, whoever is Chancellor at that point in time. So I think what the risk is that we put in a load of assumptions which make the forecast flattered, and we use that flattering of the forecast to do some tax cuts, which don't then turn out to be sustainable. So if we are going to cut taxes, if that's what we want to do, we want sustainable tax cuts that needs to be matched by sustainable spending cuts, not financed through measures that we're not serious about implementing.
Fantastic. Let's see what else. I'm going to throw this one at Ben, I think. Despite the extra money for some areas, notably defence, does this budget leave departments to manage the impact of inflation, wage and pension rises within their existing allocations, meaning significant squeezes pre-2025?
The answer is yes, to an extent, but not by much more than was already the case in the autumn. The official measure of inflation that's used for these things the next couple of years is largely unchanged relative to the autumn. That's the GDP deflator. The question is whether that truly captures the costs facing departments in terms of energy, in terms of pay awards, in terms of fuel and food and so on. It probably understates the true cost pressures a bit, particularly on things like capital budgets, where construction inflation is running at more like 10 or 15%. So the answer is yes, but not to a new or surprising degree relative to what we already knew about.
Fantastic. Thank you. Look, we're already 5 minutes over. I think we should probably bring things to an end there. Thank you ever so much to all of my colleagues for speaking. Thank you to everyone who has attended. All of our analysis is, of course, up on our website, and the presentations that you have just seen, as well as a pretty comprehensive Twitter feed from the IFS and from myself and from colleagues. So do take a look at all of that. And we look forward to seeing you at the next fiscal event, which I hope isn't until the autumn statement somewhere around November. Thank you very much.